Hi, everyone. I'm Tohar. I'm a researcher here at UC Berkeley. I'm also an undergrad, but I like saying researcher much more. I want to, before I start, give a shout out to the Haas Scholars Program. That's where I do my research. Heavy recommend. If you're at Berkeley, please apply. And I'd also like to shout out my mentor, Dr. Javon Scott Lewis, who is so influential on my work. And we already had a talk today on Black geographies of Los Angeles. That's the type of work that I really encourage everybody who's doing urban geography to study, because there's so much to learn. That's my spiel first. Let me share my screen. We'll get started on this presentation. Let's see if I can remember how to use Zoom. Is that going to be it? Let's see. 1 second, everyone. I have to actually let Zoom share my screen in my system settings. I'm woefully unprepared. Let's see if I can do it now. Yes, okay, super. Here we go. So, hidden drills, resource extraction, and minority communities in Los Angeles. Let's talk about it. So, what do you expect oil drilling to look like? What do you want in your head? When you say oil drilling, what do you see? I'm going to give you a minute to answer. Type in the chat. I want some audience participation here. You know, it's okay if you're imagining like Yosemite Sam from Looney Tunes, you know, oil, there's oil. I want to see some answers in the chat. What does oil drilling look like in your mind? And we'll take a minute to wait for an answer. All right. We have some answers for some very informed geographers and others. Big machines, says Ryan. Desiree says dirty. Magali says seacoast platform. I like that one. Industrial, rigs that bob up and down. Oh, we're going to see that later. Quinn says huge offshore oil platform. Someone here has seen the Santa Barbara coast. Destruction, oil well in the desert, away from urban communities, geology, mechanical grasshoppers. Oh, I'm stealing all these terms for my thesis. Don't worry about it, guys. Great. On the way to LAX from Santa Monica. Somebody here has been looking at my slides, I see. Okay, so oil drilling, as we've talked about, has a lot of connotations. It might be really easy to think that it's that there will be blood, massive platform in the middle of nowhere, but it's not. Sadly, nobody takes the straw and drinks your milkshake, really, in 2023, Los Angeles is oil drilling. In effect, oil drilling is a little more like this. This is my neighborhood where I grew up, Pico Robertson. And this gorgeous structure with its staid ivy-colored walls and its imposing edifice-like tower is an oil well. In fact, it's not one oil well, but it is 40 oil wells, all inside of one giant derrick building that spans over 2 blocks going westward. And you can't really tell, but these are like 12-foot thick walls that are on this building. That massive floating tower, that's not just for decoration. That's an oil derrick. That's a crane that moves between the drills. This is 2 blocks from where I grew up. And for most of my life, I didn't know what this building was. I didn't know that there was oil being drilled next to me. I didn't know about the environmental dangers of there being oil drilled next to me. I certainly was not aware that my neighborhood, which, if you're familiar with LA, you could call part of that suburban urban patchwork. I didn't understand that it was at the same time a site of industrial resource extraction. To me, that just wasn't feasible. But in fact, that's what it is. Oil wells like this, hidden wells, are all over Los Angeles's west side. Let's look at another famous example. If it'll let me, there we go. This is Beverly Hills High School. Thanks to a very small rent-controlled apartment on the south side of their district, I was lucky enough to go here. Great, good public school, good teachers, high college acceptance rate. It's the dream. What is this structure that you see in the center of the screen? This painted tower, I think they called it the Hope Tower or whatever, that is actually an oil well. that was, for my entirety of high school, an active oil drilling site on my high school campus. If you're not from, well, honestly, if you didn't go there, that might sound completely preposterous, but I'm afraid to say it's the truth. While I was in high school, there was an active oil well, and that oil well had been on my campus for a long time. In 2000, there was a very famous court case, and there was a book that came out. I think it's called Poisoning of Beverly Hills High School, Parts Per Million, by Aaron Brockovich, about a lawsuit against the school board and the district because of the localized cancer clusters that were tied to this well. In fact, right before I got there, they tore down some buildings because they found out there was so much arsenic in the soil that they had to cement over old fields and put us in bungalows on the grounds of that high school. Oil drilling in Los Angeles is not just in the middle of nowhere. It's heavily urbanized. We see it again right here. An oil well can look like this. Anyone who's from LA or has spent time there would know this is the Beverly Center, my least favorite mall, and we can get into that later. But it's part of LA's extractive landscape. This might be the front face that you see from Beverly and La Cienega. By the way, this photo is taken from a gas station where gas is now $7 a gallon. If this gives you an idea of the fanciness of the neighborhood we're in. Let's flip around to the backside of the building. This is another cluster of oil wells. The building is in an odd loop so that you don't see that it's actually hiding a bunch of oil derricks in the back. Ironically, across the street from it is the Ocean Cancer Center of Cedars-Sinai, one of the top cancer centers on the West Coast. It's this black building, or this white and black building, that you can see right above the green across the street. That's the cancer center of one of the best hospitals in the West Coast. And it's across the street from an oil drilling site. But these hidden wells may be pervasive, but they're not exactly representative of LA's extractive landscape. For every one that's hidden, there are many that are exposed. And that's where we get to the Inglewood producing oil field. Someone in the chat earlier mentioned those pumps you see on the way to LAX. These are those pumps. In fact, in this area, which you can see abuts a bunch of single-family homes, you see them up on the ridge, little boxes on the hillside. But that's, you know, a Daly City reference, not quite LA. But all of those houses are looking down on a giant fallow field, which is completely full of these drinking birds of oil wells. In fact, it's not just what you see in this picture. It's a massive scar in the landscape of an active oil field. Can everyone see? Look at the bottom of the map, the bottom yellow arrow. All of that is an oil field, except for a little bit of that northeast corner of it, which is now a park, Kenneth Hahn, and we'll talk about that as well. But if you look on top, the hidden wells aren't far from this massive open scar. This is all in a very dense area of the West Side. And as you can see, this is kind of the center of West LA. This is dense building. These people live here. We're not in the middle of Santa Clarita in the mountains where you can drill oil and people won't see it. We're right there in the thick of it. In fact, this is a distance of only 3.2 miles between these two sites. I'm going specifically from the Pico Doheny drill site to the Baldwin Hills Inglewood field. So how is drilling played out so differently in these two areas? I hear you asking yourself. Let's go back and do some history, and we'll start pulling out some more maps since it's UCGIS week. So excuse the low resolution, but the original version of this photo is 15,000 pixels by 15,000 pixels. By the mid-1930s, oil exploration in Southern California had established that petroleum reserves existed under the West Side. For a long, long time, they've known that the oil fields under LA are everywhere. It's not just in the middle of nowhere. In fact, here's a map from, I believe, 1936 by the Department of Forestry and Fire Warden, where you can see 3 big oil fields, and actually they're much bigger than this. This is only what they thought they were in the 60s. And you have A, the Beverly Hills oil field, B, the Salt Lake oil field, no Mormons, no Utah, but it still has Salt Lake right there. And D, the Inglewood producing oil field. That's the one that we just saw photos of. These 3 oil fields actually span a variety of neighborhoods. And to understand the extractive regime, we're going to have to understand the neighborhoods as well. So everybody knows this map. If you know it, type it in the chat. It's redlining. I think we all here have heard plenty about it, but I'll very, very quickly just say redlining, the Homeowner Loan Corporation, as part of a New Deal project in the 30s, extended mortgages for home renovation and purchase. They didn't extend them equitably, and they actually extended it on a basis of racial discrimination, in which minority neighborhoods, especially Black neighborhoods, were shut out of very beneficial federally backed mortgage loans. And those are called, well, who cares what they're called? But the neighborhoods that were most affected were considered red line neighborhoods. And that's because on a scale of green, blue, yellow, red, they ranked in the bottom, red. They were considered an unwise investment for the US government. In effect, it was legalized discrimination through the government's own methods of bureaucracy. If we zoom in on the west side, look at the center, track C109, C77, and C76. This is Pico Robertson, the area we saw earlier. These are all C tier, or right below bottom tier neighborhoods. And we'll get into it later, but it's because they were minority neighborhoods, and they still are. This has been essentially the same ethnic enclave since the 20s of a Jewish West Side center in Los Angeles. But if you look a little further north, Beverly Hills, or even further west than this map shows, in the Pacific Palisades, all of these A-rated areas are actually sitting on the same oil fields that we saw in the previous map. But we don't see the drilling there. And just one more note about redlining, we see wealth disparities played out over neighborhoods through a racialized landscape, even 50 years after landmark legislation or landmark rulings repealing the whole redlining legislation. So just keep in mind as we go forward here that spatialized patterns of wealth remain, and they remain pervasive. So here is, and I've got the 5-minute warning, so I'm going to start speeding up. Here is the a map that I made, just use QuickGIS, where you can see in blue oil wells over the redlining map of Los Angeles, and I grayed out the A and B tier because it's not as important. What you can actually really see is you see a very strong correlation between drilling and redline neighborhoods. But we already know, based on the maps that we saw earlier, that these drills don't need to be in these redline neighborhoods per se. In fact, these drills could be in those A-tier neighborhoods, and they can access the oil from there. So why are they only in D and C-tier neighborhoods, or mostly in? One more perspective before we figure that out. Here is the density of oil drilling, which is in green, overlaid on a data set that I found at UCLA's Charles Young of a high-rise office complex building in the post-war period. Do you notice not all areas are extractive or commercial? There's significant overlap. This is part of the urban extractive hidden landscape of oil. So what does this all mean? Resource extraction has become a way to make space productive. Some areas already had high property values since they were good neighborhoods, cemented by redlining. But many spaces were also found to sit on oil deposits. How do you use both of these modes of capital accumulation? In order to capitalize on both, hidden drills were constructed. And that's where we get into the beautification of the hidden drills I showed earlier. By comparison, redlined areas have a lower value in the real estate landscape, right? So these established disparities actually diminish the concerns about aesthetics of the neighborhood. People were less concerned about having neighborhoods in which you had giant open oil drilling because it wasn't about upkeeping these property values. And actually, Baldwin Hills and Ladera Heights are two historically wealthy Black neighborhoods in LA, adjacent to the open oil field of the Inglewood open oil field. So finally, we're going to look at power resources and the mitigation of oil extraction. The Pacific Palisades has a large offshore reserve, which was discovered in the 60s. But well-organized interest groups successfully opposed the expansion of drilling by the late 80s. This is an area that has oil, but it was an A-rated wealthy subdivision. It's predominantly white. They even had Mayor Bradley on their side about this, and this area still has not been drilled. even though Occidental Petroleum, the same company that wanted to drill here, opened in the same year, in 1966, the tower you see on the right in Pico Robertson. Even though current legislators oppose this well, it continues to pump because this area has access to oil, but it was only a C-tier subdivision due to, and yes, the Hulk redlining documents say this, a definite infiltration of Hebrew families, like myself. But it was proximate to Beverly Hills, and Jewish identity, especially before the influx of Middle Eastern Jews to Pico Robertson, was approaching whiteness in LA's mid-century landscape. So how do they put these two things in tension, actually in consonance? Hidden drilling. The well on the right was constructed to look like the tower of the synagogue on the left. And if you ever read my thesis, whenever it gets finished, we'll talk plenty about this too. Finally, Baldwin Hills. This is oil drilling in a field adjacent to historically Black neighborhoods, which are mostly C-rated in this map. And that's due to a number of reasons why they weren't D-rated, but it's not that important for this presentation. What is important is that drilling here had serious consequences. It caused, or at least it's likely to have caused, a massive dam collapse in the 60s that killed scores, I want to say, or it killed a few people, but it destroyed a bunch of homes. And this is still an operational oil field. The first steps to stopping drilling here has only come in 2021 with county-wide policies to stop resource extraction in Los Angeles, but these policies have only negated new oil permits. These wells are still pumping and nothing is stopping them. Finally, let's remember that oil extraction in LA's landscape is more than just an aesthetic and real estate choice. Yes, they build wells that are hidden because they look nicer and they upkeep the real estate values. In fact, the mayor at the time of the opening of the 1966 well, Sam Yorty, actually said explicitly that the Occidental Petroleum well was so good because it upkept property values from its beautiful facade. But in fact, there's the health aspect. And there hasn't been enough studies done about this in California, but plenty have been done in Texas. And we can extrapolate using GIS data here. Here is a map I made of oil wells in blue, active oil wells in California, with asthma rates in Los Angeles. Can you see what I see? There's a definite correlation between oil drilling and higher asthma rates. And in fact, asthma clusters directly follow oil drilling. You can see that there's a very, very close relationship here. And these are minority communities that are suffering the brunt of health effects just because the oil drilling in their neighborhoods has been deemed a way to make them resourceful and useful and productive in this capitalist real estate landscape, which, if you're familiar with LA, it's a real estate landscape. So, I skipped my last slide. A final thought. Oil drilling has been fittingly an underground industry for Los Angeles. Despite having once produced a quarter of the world's oil in the 1930s, most Angelenos fail to recognize the scars oil drilling has left on the landscape. The effects of which, be it through air pollution, industrial decay, yes, that oil well did burn down on my high school campus the year after I graduated, or housing insufficiency. Imagine what you can build on that massive swath of land. Or, honestly, a park. LA doesn't have green space, except for where there used to be a dam that exploded due to drilling. Either way, all of this harms Angelenos of color disproportionately versus affluent white neighborhoods that have benefited from years of housing security, of generational wealth, and of a lack of oil drilling. So, now that I'm done babbling, let's take some questions. You all have been a great audience. I'm ready.
Thank you so much, Tohar, for that interesting talk. As a reminder, please put questions in the chat as you won't be able to unmute yourself. Got a question in the chat from John. Your classmates in cartographic representation at UC Berkeley, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, cartographic representation. Shout out Geog 183. Everybody take it. Make maps. I see a comment from Rosanna in the chat. I'm not familiar actually with that activist, but I will be saving that link and going into it. Thank you, Jeff, for the kind words. If anyone has more questions, please shoot, because I love to talk about this stuff. As you can tell, I really love to talk about this stuff. I want to shout out also to all the Berkeley students and Berkeley Geog people I see here. I see Nika, I see Alexis. So what do we
And
know
we've
about
got
health
a
impacts?
Yes, we've
Sorry,
got
would
a
you like?
question from Nika about impacts on soil quality and groundwater, and blending into that, a question from Rosanna. What do we know about health impacts other than asthma?
Superb. I'm really happy. And even the next question I'm seeing from Annika also ties in here. So let's do them all in one big answer. Essentially, asthma is just a very fun thing to talk about. That doesn't sound right, but it's very easy to show that data set. We have documents talking about actually the earliest opposition to oil drilling in California in the 1920s, talking about Venice, where a big issue was that all of these kind of Wild Westy prospectors would drill these exploratory wells, pump a bunch of petroleum, but there was no environmental regulation, there was no EPA, and this is very rudimentary. It actually was more like the There Will Be Blood kind of oil drilling. And you would have massive oil slicks entering the water table. That actually was the birth of the first anti-petroleum movement in California in the 1920s in Los Angeles. And there's a great reading by Quam Wickham. I think that's the last name. I think it's 1998, Quam Wickham, which talks about that specifically. So soil quality and groundwater negatively impacted. Again, my high school, they cemented over an open field that used to be the lacrosse field at my high school. They cemented over it because the arsenic levels were so high from the oil well being on the campus. A contemporary of mine was telling me yesterday about a study in Peru where they found that people who lived next to oil extractive sites had higher cadmium levels in their blood than were legally allowed. So health impacts other than asthma, there were another person. Health impacts other than asthma, cancer clusters. So my high school faced, or the board that runs my school district that I was in, faced a lot of lawsuits about cancer clusters. I actually know a few people who developed cancer that might actually be related to those wells. And then we're going to talk about the winds very quickly that might drive airborne pollution. Actually, that's why you see wells. I can go back a couple slides, maybe. That's why you see wells on the west side that actually don't have a high asthma rate near them. The marine layer winds are pushing them in to where they really start to settle closer to mid-city. And if we were to zoom this map out to get to the mountains towards the Inland Empire, that's where you see the biggest nexus of the pollution. The Cal EPA, I'm going to go through some other things I see in the chat. So Cal EPA environmental screen mapping system, I've looked into it. Some of the data I've been working with is from there. And how does the location of oil wells correlate to brownfield sites? Great question. Somebody should do research on that. I'll have to look into it.
All right, thank you so much again, Tohar, for your talk.